Now it's time for our sponsored perspective portion of this morning's discussion, which is programmed by Biogen. Please join me in welcoming on stage Soren Motke, who is a senior scientist and managing director of RAND Health Advisory Services.
Thank you, Joanna. Pleasure to be here and present the results from our report on what do the numbers say. So Alzheimer's, as you know, is a very common and a very prevalent disease. And what we will need to figure out is how to prepare the healthcare system. What we have done is we looked at, is the US healthcare system ready to actually deliver an Alzheimer treatment if indeed we will have it in a few years? So what we have learned in clinical research, like decades and billions of dollars later, is that Alzheimer's cannot be cured. It needs to be prevented. We need to find people with early signs of dementia, which we call mild cognitive impairment. We need to diagnose them, find whether they have the biologic hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, and then treat them before full-blown dementia develops. This preventive treatment paradigm raises two problems. First, we have a large number of prevalent cases, as we call them, people that have never been diagnosed for early stage Alzheimer's. And we have a very common disease, as we just heard. So we will have to process millions of people through initial evaluation, confirmatory diagnosis, and then delivery of treatment in order to apply a cure if we have it. So we did a simulation model just to get our hands around the magnitude of the problem. And I have to qualify, this is a simulation, so we can't really exactly tell you what's going to happen. We give you an order of magnitude. So if we have a treatment in 2020, hopefully, we will start, say, screening people for early signs of the disease, and we will start doing this in the mid-50s. We will have about 70 million people that need to be evaluated because they have early memory loss. Of those, about 7.5 million people will need to see a specialist for further evaluation and treatment. About 6.7 million people might need a so-called amyloid scan, which is kind of similar like a CT scan, an imaging technique that shows whether you have these amyloid deposits in your brain that are indicative of the disease. And then about 3 million people will return back to a specialist for further evaluation and discussion of treatment options. And then about 2.4 million people will need to be treated when the drug becomes first available. So this is basically all assuming that there are no capacity constraints in the system. You can just go in, get your diagnosis, get your treatment delivered, and move on. Of course, these are very, very, very large numbers, even if you compare them to the burden of disease that is about 5 million people with manifest disease. So what will happen? We estimated how long will it actually take to get through all these patients given current capacity and the constraints in the capacity. So what we estimate here is that people will, in the first years that we have the treatment, wait for approximately 1.5 years to actually receive treatment. 1.5 years in the richest country of the world. That's pretty remarkable given that you talk about a progressive neurodegenerative disorder where waiting for treatment is not just losing time, it is losing memory. So the first and biggest constraint initially will be access to specialty care. We don't have that many people, that many physicians who are trained in dementia diagnosis and management. We have neurologists, geriatricians and such, but there are not enough of those to see all these patients and make sure that they get diagnosed and then referred to treatment. The second constraint, once we get through the immediate issue of specialty care, is access to amyloid scanners, which are kind of these CT-like things where you get your brain scanned. Not as hard to resolve because they can be built. It's somewhat of a problem with geographic access because these devices are very expensive and you need a specialized facility to manufacture the compound that's actually used to make your brain with amyloid deposits light up. And so we will have a problem of delivering that to rural areas where there are just not enough people to sustain such an expensive technology. And then the last obstacle will become later on the delivery of care. This is likely going to be an intravenous drug, so it's not like going to CVS and getting your aspirin. It's intravenous delivery over several months or weeks, and we need the infusion centers to actually do that. So if you look at this chart, you can see that it will take until about 2030, so over a decade, until we actually work through the backlog of patients that already have early stage dementia today. That's a fairly long time period for, again, a progressive disorder. And what that means is that on the wait list, we might see as many as 2.1 million Americans develop manifest dementia. So while we have a treatment available that can slow down the progression of the disease, over 2 million people might still develop it just because they cannot get treatment for lack of capacity. What can we do? We can, of course, increase capacity. The things that are reasonably easy is to make diagnostic capacity more accessible. As I mentioned, these amyloid scanners that scan your brain, they can be manufactured. There's no kind of technical constraint. There's a money constraint. We can add to those and make them more accessible. There's also another test in development that uses cerebral spinal fluid, so basically a spinal tap to retrieve some of the fluid around your brain. And then you can send it to a lab and diagnose whether there's amyloid in your brain. That's a test that can be done pretty much anywhere. Not too pleasant, as many women can attest to have had an epidural, but doable and easily scalable. Infusion delivery is also something that we can probably fix because you can go to home infusion, you can go to other infusion centers, and it's basically a chair with an infusion pole, so it's not too complicated to add capacity to that if sort of reimbursement and regulation are in place. So if we do that, we estimate that we can save about $800,000 from 800,000 patients from dementia. If we solve the capacity constraint on the specialty side, and the capacity constraints on diagnosis and delivery, we can save basically all of these 2.1 million people. But obviously, specialists in medicine do not grow on trees. It is a 8-year, 10-year training to become, from like a college graduate, go to being a dementia specialist. So that's nothing that can be fixed easily, and that is nothing that we can fix quickly. So how do we get there? The first and most urgent issue based on our analysis is that we must train more providers, and we must train them quickly. Hence, we can't start with medical students. We have to start with larger specialty societies like internal medicine, general psychiatry. So people that have some familiarity with dementia but haven't had full training in diagnosis and treatment of dementia. That's our sort of sole path to getting enough people to take care of these patients. And there are also tools to make them more efficient, better tests, more automation, telemedicine, so that we can make more of the time of the few specialists that we have. And then as I mentioned, we can expand the range of diagnostic technologies that are sort of less capital intense to apply and make them more accessible geographically. And we can use all the options for infusion delivery, so not just fixed centers, but also home infusion, which fortunately the 21st Century Cures Act made accessible for Medicare beneficiaries. And then we have to deal with coverage of services and tests. Many of these things are not really reimbursed right now because we didn't use them all that much. And this is going to be an important money question because of the prevalence of the disease. So overall, it is a complex challenge. No individual stakeholder will be able to do this alone. We all need to pull together specialty societies, policymakers, the greater public, the advocacy community from which we heard. we got to pull together and figure this out, because we cannot let 2 million people get robbed of their memory, of their minds, if we have a treatment available. That's just not an acceptable solution. And we need to act fast. I mean, we have said that it is going to take years until we have a drug or a treatment, but it will also take years until we have all these things in place to deliver this drug, and we really want to be ready when this drug is on the market. Thank you.